Hey guys, welcome to Medifaction. So today we are going to learn about the mechanism behind breathing. So you all must be aware about the respiration, which is nothing but the process by which oxygen is taken in and carbon dioxide is given out. So we're going to look in detail to learn more about the mechanism. So in this video, I am going to enumerate about the respiratory movements, which includes an introduction, muscles of respiration, movements of thoracic cage, movements of lungs. We are also going to discuss about the respiratory pressure, intra-pleural pressure, intra-alveolar pressure, and we are also going to learn about the compliance and the definition about it and types of compliance and some important applied physiology. Let's move on to the introduction of respiratory movements. Respiration occurs in two phases, namely inspiration and expiration. During inspiration, the thoracic cage enlarges and lungs expand so that the air enters the lungs easily. This diagram easily depicts what inspiration is. Whereas during expiration, the thoracic cage and lungs decreases in size and attain the pre-inspiratory position so that air leaves the lungs easily. During normal quiet breathing, inspiration is the active process and expiration is the passive process. Muscles of respiration. Respiratory muscles are of two types. Number one is the inspiratory muscles. Number two is the expiratory muscles. However, respiratory muscles are generally classified into two types. Number one is the primary or major respiratory muscles, which are responsible for the change in size of thoracic cage during normal quiet breathing. Number two is the accessory respiratory muscles that help primary respiratory muscles during forced respiration. Inspiratory muscles. Muscles involved in inspiratory movements are known as inspiratory muscles. Primary inspiratory muscles are the diaphragm, which is supplied by the phrenic nerve, and external intercostal muscles supplied by intercostal nerves. Here you can appreciate the dome-shaped diaphragm just above the abdomen. Moving on to the accessory inspiratory muscles. The sternocleidomastoid, scaleni, anterior serrati, elevators of scapulae, and pectorals are the accessory inspiratory muscles. This is the serrator anterior. This is the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Now let's check the expiratory muscles. Primary expiratory muscles are the internal intercostal muscles which are innervated by the intercostal nerves. Here you can see the internal intercostal muscle just behind the external intercostal muscles. Moving on to the accessory expiratory muscles, these are the abdominal muscles. Here you can appreciate the abdominal muscles which include the rectus abdominis, the external obliques, the internal obliques, and the transverse abdominis. Movements of thoracic cage. Inspiration causes enlargement of thoracic cage. Thoracic cage enlarges because of increase in the all diameters, which is anteroposterior, transverse, and vertical diameters. Anteroposterior and transverse diameters of thoracic cage are increased by the elevation of ribs. Vertical diameter is increased by the descent of diaphragm. In general, change in the size of thoracic cavity occurs because of the movements of four units of structures, which are number one is the thoracic lid, number two is the upper costal series, number three is the lower costal series, whereas number four is the diaphragm. Now let's learn more about these four. The thoracic lid. Thoracic lid is formed by manubrium sterni and the first pair of ribs. Here you can see the manubrium sterni and the first pair of ribs. This is the thoracic inlet. It is also called thoracic operculum. Movement of thoracic lid increases the anteroposterior diameter of thoracic cage. Due to the contraction of scalene muscles, the first rib moves upward to a more horizontal position. This increases the anteroposterior diameter of upper thoracic cage. Number 2 is the upper costal series. Upper costal series is constituted by second to sixth pair of ribs. Movement of upper costal series increases the anteroposterior and transverse diameter of the thoracic cage. Movement of upper costal series is of two types, pump handle movement and the bucket handle movement. Let's learn what is pump handle movement and bucket handle movement. Pump handle movement is the contraction of external intercostal muscles which causes elevation of these ribs and upward and forward movement of sternum. This here depicts the pump handle movement. Whereas in bucket handle movement, simultaneously the central portions of these ribs move upwards and outwards to a more horizontal position. Like here you can observe, just like the handle of a bucket. This movement is called bucket handle movement and it increases the transverse diameter of the thoracic cage. Number 3. The lower costal series. Lower costal series includes 7th to 10th pair of ribs. Movement of lower costal series increases the transverse diameter of thoracic cage by bucket handle movement. Bucket handle movement, as we told earlier, it is similar here also. The lower costal series of ribs also show bucket handle movement by swinging outward and upward. This movement increases the transverse diameter of the thoracic cage. 11th and 12th pairs of ribs are the floating ribs. These ribs are not involved in changing the size of thoracic cage. Number 4 is the diaphragm. Movement of diaphragm increases the vertical diameter of thoracic cage. Normally, before inspiration, the diaphragm is dome-shaped with convexity facing upwards. During inspiration, due to the contraction, muscle fibers are shortened, but the central tendinous portion is drawn downwards, so the diaphragm is flattened now. Flattening of diaphragm increases the vertical diameter of the thoracic cage. Here you can clearly observe, while inspiration, the diaphragm contracts, while here when expiration takes place, the diaphragm tends to relax. Movements of lungs. During inspiration, due to the enlargement of thoracic cage, the negative pressure is increased in the thoracic cavity. This causes expansion of the lungs. During expiration, the thoracic cavity decreases in size to the pre-inspiratory position. Pressure in the thoracic cage also comes back to the pre-inspiratory level. It compresses the lung tissue so that the air is expelled out of lungs. Collapsing tendency of lungs. Lungs are under constant threat to collapse even in resting condition because of certain factors. These factors are mainly two factors are responsible for the collapsing tendency of lungs. Number 1 is the elastic property of lung tissue. Elastic tissues of lungs show constant recoiling tendency and try to collapse the lungs. Number 2 is the surface tension. It is the tension exerted by the fluid secreted from alveolar epithelium on the surface of alveolar membrane. This is how a collapsed lungs look like. Fortunately, there are some factors which save the lungs from collapsing. So, what are these preventing factors? In spite of elastic property of lungs and surface tension in the alveoli of lungs, the collapsing tendency of lungs is prevented by two factors mainly. Number 1 is the intra-pleural pressure. It is the pressure in the pleural cavity which is always negative. Because of its negativity, It keeps the lungs expanded and prevents the collapsing tendency of the lungs produced by the elastic tissues. Surfactant. It is a substance secreted in alveolar epithelium. It reduces surface tension and prevents the collapsing tendency produced by surface tension. Let's learn more about surfactant. Surfactant is a surface acting material or agent that is responsible for lowering the surface tension of a fluid. Surfactant that lines the epithelium of the alveoli in lungs is known as pulmonary surfactant, and it decreases the surface tension on the alveolar membrane. So this is the alveolar membrane, and there are two types of cell, type 1 cell and type 2 alveolar cell. The type 2 alveolar cell here secretes the surfactant. Source and secretion of pulmonary surfactant. Pulmonary surfactant is secreted by two types of cell. Type 2 alveolar epithelial cells in the lungs, which are called surfactant secreting alveolar cells or pneumocytes. Characteristic feature of these cells is the presence of microvilli on their alveolar surface. Clara cells, which are situated in the bronchioles. These cells are called bronchiolar exocrine cells. Chemistry of surfactant. Surfactant is a lipoprotein complex formed by lipids, especially phospholipids, proteins, and ions. Phospholipids. Phospholipids form about 75% of the surfactant. Major phospholipid present in the surfactant is dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine, otherwise DPPC. Other lipids. Other lipid substances of surfactant are triglycerides and phosphatidylglycerol. Proteins. Proteins of the surfactant are called specific surfactant proteins. There are four main surfactant proteins called SPA, SPB, SPC, and SPD. SPA and SPD are hydrophilic, while SPB and SPC are hydrophobic. Surfactant proteins are vital components of the surfactant, and the surfactant becomes inactive in the absence of proteins. Ions. Ions present in the surfactant are mostly calcium ions. Formation of surfactant. Type 2 alveolar epithelial cells and Clara cells have a special type of membrane-bound organelles called lamellar bodies, which form the intracellular source of surfactant. Laminar bodies contain surfactant phospholipids and surfactant proteins. These materials are synthesized in endoplasmic reticulum and stored in laminar bodies. By means of exocytosis, lipids and proteins of lamellar bodies are released into surface fluid lining the alveoli. Here, in the presence of surfactant proteins and calcium, the phospholipids are arranged into a lattice, otherwise known as a meshwork structure called tubular myelin. Tubular myelin is in turn converted into surfactant in the form of a film that spreads over the entire surface of alveoli. Most of the surfactant is absorbed into the type 2 alveolar cells, catabolized, and products are loaded into lamellar bodies for recycling. Let's move on to the importance. It plays an important role in the inflation of lungs after birth. In fetus, the secretion of surfactant begins after third month. Until birth, the lungs are solid and are not expanded. Soon after birth, the first breath starts because of the stimulation of respiratory centers by hypoxia and hypercapnia. Although the respiratory movements are attempted by the infant, the lungs tend to collapse repeatedly, and the presence of surfactant in the alveoli prevents the lungs from collapsing. The second most important point is that its role in defense within the lungs against infection and inflammation. Hydrophilic proteins such as SpA and SPD destroy the bacteria and viruses by means of opsonization. These two proteins also control the formation of inflammatory mediators. Effect of deficiency of surfactant. Respiratory distress syndrome. Absence of surfactant in infants cause collapse of lungs, and the condition is called respiratory distress syndrome or hyaline membrane disease. Deficiency of surfactant occurs in adults also, and it is called adult respiratory distress syndrome. In addition, the deficiency of surfactant increases the susceptibility of bacterial and viral infections. Respiratory pressures. Two types of pressures are exerted in the thoracic cavity and lungs during process of respiration. One is intrapleural pressure, two is intra-alveolar pressure. Let's learn about intrapleural pressure. Intrapleural pressure is the pressure existing in the pleural cavity, that is, in between the visceral and the parietal layer of pleura. It is exerted by the suction of fluid that lines the pleural cavity. It is also called intrathoracic pressure since it is exerted in the whole of the thoracic cavity. Here you can appreciate the intrapleural pressure. This blue color. Moving on. Cause for the negativity of intrapleural pressure. Pleural cavity is always lined by a thin layer of fluid that is secreted by the visceral layer of pleura. This fluid is constantly pumped from the pleural cavity into the lymphatic vessels. Pumping of fluid creates the negative pressure in the pleural cavity. Intrapleural pressure becomes positive in Valsalva maneuver and in some pathological conditions such as pneumothorax, hydrothorax, hemothorax, and pyothorax. The significance of intrapleural pressure is throughout the respiratory cycle, intrapleural pressure remains lower than intra-alveolar pressure. This keeps the lungs always inflated. Intrapleural pressure has two important functions. Number one, it prevents the collapsing tendency of lungs as we told earlier. Number two is that because of the negative pressure in thoracic region, larger veins and vena cava are enlarged, that is dilated. Also, the negative pressure acts like suction pump and pulls the venous blood from the lower part of the body towards the heart against gravity. Thus, the intrapleural pressure is responsible for venous return. So, it is called respiratory pump for venous return. Next, moving on to intra-alveolar pressure. Intra-alveolar pressure is the pressure existing in the alveoli of the lungs. It is also known as intrapulmonary pressure. In normal values, the intra-alveolar pressure is equal to the atmospheric pressure, which is 760 mm of mercury. It becomes negative during inspiration and positive during expiration. The significance of intra-alveolar pressure is that it causes flow of air in and out of alveoli. During inspiration, the intra-alveolar pressure becomes negative, so the atmospheric air enters the alveoli. During expiration, the intra-alveolar pressure becomes positive, so air is expelled out of the alveoli. Intra-alveolar pressure also helps in exchange of gases between the alveolar air and the blood. Now, let's learn about the transpulmonary pressure. It is the measure of elastic force in lungs which is responsible for collapsing tendency of lungs. Here you can see the intra-alveolar pressure. This region covers the this intra-alveolar pressure. Compliance. It is the ability of the lungs and thorax to expand, or it is the expansibility of lungs and thorax. It is defined as the change in volume per unit change in the pressure. Types of compliance. Compliance is of two types, static compliance and dynamic compliance. Let's learn about static compliance. It is the compliance measured under static condition, that is, by measuring pressure and volume when breathing does not take place. Static compliance is the pressure required to overcome the elastic resistance of respiratory system for a given tidal volume under zero flow condition, that is static. Dynamic compliance. This is the compliance measured during dynamic condition, that is during breathing. Now let's move on to some important physiology. Applied physiology. Increase in compliance. Compliance increases due to loss of elastic property of lung tissues, which occurs both in physiological and pathological conditions. Physiological condition, a good example is old age. Pathological condition is when the subject is caused with emphysema. Decrease in compliance. Compliance decreases in several pathological conditions such as deformities of thorax like kyphosis and scoliosis. This is what a kyphosis is. Your vertebral column tends to have big curvatures. Number 2. Fibrotic pleurisy, that is inflammation of pleura resulting in fibrosis. Number 3 is paralysis of respiratory muscles. Number 4 is pleural effusion. Number 5 is abnormal thorax such as pneumothorax, hydrothorax, hemothorax and pyothorax. Hope you have understood the video. Like, subscribe and press the bell button for more videos. Thank you. Thanks for watching.